Hello everybody, it's Mr. Sean. I'm back in my backyard, and because we've had all this rain recently, I want to talk about mosses. Mosses are a small green plant without any true roots that use spores rather than seeds to reproduce. They're very often found in damp areas, and they like acidic soils, which is why they do so well in my backyard here in the Pine Barrens, because the Pine Barrens have a highly acidic soil, and my backyard has a thick layer of clay under it, which keeps the water from going into the soil and keeps the whole area kind of like a bog. So the first moss I'd like to talk to you about today is sphagnum moss, or peat moss. Sphagnum moss grows in wet and boggy areas when it likes a highly acidic soil, so it has a low pH. It has small, tooth-like leaves with hair-like tufts growing around its stem, and it can grow in either small clusters or in large mats. So you can actually lift it up like it's a rug and see underneath. And we can see that it grows all in that one big chunk together. Now, sphagnum moss is great for retaining water, so it's really nice if you dry it out and then add it to the soil for your garden, because it will help absorb all that water into the soil. Along with its moisture retention, peat moss or sphagnum moss is also a great habitat for invertebrates, much like this earthworm. So the next moss I want to talk to you about today is joint-toothed moss, often referred to as true moss. The leaves of the joint-toothed moss grow in small, spear-like shapes in 3 or more rows around the central stem. Joint-toothed moss grows what's known as a sporangium on a thin, tough stalk called a seta. Now that is common amongst all mosses, as mosses use spores to reproduce, unlike other plants that use seeds. Joint-toothed moss grows similar to sphagnum moss, where it can grow in a large bed, but unlike sphagnum moss, it's not as easily moved like a carpet as we saw with the sphagnum moss. Now here in the shade, we can see that joint-toothed moss growing those sporangium on those thin woody seta. Again, the sporangium is where the spores are produced and released for mosses, and it's growing a lot better here in the shade because it gets less sunlight, so it doesn't cook as fast, and because the side here has a lot more moisture to it, the spores of mosses are more easily spread. Mosses tend to spread their spores not through the wind, but through the water as it rains. And that helps ensure that those spores are delivered to an area that is going to have the moisture required for the moss to grow healthy. So the last moss I want to talk to you about today is the green shield moss. Green shield moss grows on hard surfaces like trees on their bark or even on rocks. Now, what's interesting about green shield moss is it's not actually a moss. Green shield moss is what's called a lichen, and lichen are actually 2 organisms in a symbiotic relationship. It is a fungus and an algae. The algae is its single cell full of chlorophyll that can make food from sunlight, and the fungus that surrounds it with mycelia, the little spaghetti strands that make up a fungus that help protect the algae and help it attach to those hard surfaces like tree bark and rocks. So the fungus gives it a place to live, and the algae gives it its food. Here we can see the 2 mosses we've talked about so far growing together. On our left is the joint-toothed moss, and on our right is the sphagnum moss. And one of the reasons I love mosses like this is because it's kind of like a micro version of a forest. Not only because they look like trees, but the environment itself around these mosses acts like a small forest, right down to the animals that live inside, from moss mites to ants and beetles and even those earthworms we saw before, to how the mosses interact with each other, growing in their own individual groups, spreading out, and sometimes having a bit of a mix in their mats of different species. So if you were to take a wide view of a forest, it would look like mosses, only they're much bigger.